Thank you. So I'm Paula Harris. I work at the Jewish United Fund, which is one of the organizations that co-sponsors this annual lecture. First of all, I applaud all of you for coming out. It's wonderful to see so many people in person once again. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And as you can see, we're standing room only. So very much appreciated. I hope that everybody isn't too uncomfortable standing during what I think is going to be a fabulous lecture. So just to give you a little history of the Klutznick lecture, in 1986, Philip and Ethel Klutznick endowed an annual lecture that would be a joint endeavor between the Jewish United Fund / Jewish Federation and Northwestern University. It has been a wonderful experience going through decades and decades of this lecture with so many academics covering a variety of topics. So this is just one, going forward. And we hope to continue this relationship long into the future. So now that you have a little history of that, just so you know again that I just want to iterate the wonderful partnership that JUF and the Federation have with Northwestern University. We have a lot of shared values in terms of Jewish education, Israel education, and this is just one of the endeavors that we undertake. I wanted to just give a little shout out to one of our organizations, institutions that's on campus, which is the Northwestern Hillel. Unfortunately, Michael Simon, who's the executive director, is not able to be here tonight. He sends his regrets. But I did want to give a shout out to a previous director who is Rabbi Michael Belinsky, a dear friend. And he's going to not be happy that I gave him a shout out, but he was the director for at least 25 years. Michael has been the director for 13 years. This was his bar mitzvah year. And I would say that the Northwestern Hillel is one of our premier Hillels across the country, and we're very proud of the relationship that they have with Northwestern University. It's a very welcoming space for Jewish students, Israeli faculty, Israeli students. So, I'm going to give a shout out to Northwestern University, and now I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand the microphone over to Professor Ken Seeskin, who is the Klutznick he's the Klutznick Professor Emeritus, okay? And he also gave many lectures as part of this, so.
Thank you, Paula. Well, spring is finally here, or at least it was for a while. And we have two great speakers tonight. And we have a large, lively audience. I can see that. So what could be better? Can the Messiah be far off? I don't know. As Paul indicated, I'm a professor emeritus. I was on the faculty of Northwestern for 48 years, a long time. In all that time, I've introduced a lot of speakers, but I don't recall ever having introduced two speakers in one lecture with anywhere near the distinction of what we have tonight. But tonight is really a special night as I see it. David Myers holds the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History at UCLA. He received his A.B. from Yale in 1982, his doctorate at Columbia in 1991. He has served as chair of the UCLA History Department and director of the UCLA Center for Jewish Studies. As of 2017, he serves as director of the Luskin Center for History and Policy. He's written extensively in the fields of modern Jewish intellectual and cultural history. Anybody who works in Jewish studies is familiar with his work. His books include Reinventing the Jewish Past, European Jewish Intellectuals and the Zionist Return to History, Revisiting History, Historicism and its Discontents in German Jewish Thought, Between Jew and Arab, The Lost Voice of Simon Rawitowitz. Jewish History, a very short introduction. The Stakes of History on the Use and Abuse of Jewish History for Life. He's also edited or co-edited 8 books, lots of distinguished art. If I went over everything he's done, we wouldn't get out of here till Purim. So I'll have to cut that short. Naomi Stolzenberg holds the Nathan and Lily Chappelle Chair in Law at USC. She graduated summa cum laude at Yale and magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where she was an editor of the Harvard Law Review. She helped establish and now directs the USC Center for Law, History, and Culture. Her scholarly publications include the often cited He Drew a Circle That Shut Me Out, Simulation, Indoctrination, and Paradox of a Liberal Education, The Profanity of Law, Writing the Relationship Between Race and Religion. Most of her recent work focuses on issues of religious accommodation and political theology. She's currently developing a theory of faith-based discrimination. Anyway, together they have published a book with Princeton University Press, 2022, American Shtetl, Making of Kiryas, a Hasidic village in upstate New York. This has raised a lot of legal and historical problems, and that is the title of tonight's lecture. So I present to you the dynamic duo. Here they are.
Thank you. I think I'm going to use this. Can you hear me in the back? Opinions are divided on that. Let me take one more. If you can't hear me, can you raise your hand? Oh, that's a trick question. Okay, are we able to raise the volume at all? If not, how about now? Okay, I'm going to try and speak as loudly as I possibly can. What a great pleasure it is to be with you here at Northwestern University. This is our first time giving a lecture at this great university, and we really are delighted to see such a turnout, which in a long series of talks about this book may be the most packed room we've ever seen. And I have to say, it's part of the revelation to us as decidedly coastal people about the greatness of Chicago, which our daughter is a graduate student at another university in this town. We've been coming to visit on a couple of occasions. We plan to come back many times to really grasp the depth and breadth of this great city, which has been so impressive to us. I also have to say what a great honor it is to give a lecture in memory of Philip and Ethel Klutznick, who really are exemplars of selfless devotion to community, both to the Jewish community and to the wider American and, for that matter, international communities. They really represent what it means to be inspired, intelligent leaders. And they really understand what the meaning of the word community is, which is, of course, relevant to the subject of tonight's lecture, because we want to talk to you about a very special community, a community that we will see in a minute, I hope, is part of a wider network of communities that we call Haredi, a Hebrew word that often would be translated in a different era as ultra-Orthodox, that is to say traditionalist orthodoxy that regards modernity as a threat to the ongoing existence and preservation of communal norms. Many of you may have seen this story on September 11th, 2022, devoted to an investigative report about Hasidic and more generally Haredi schools in the New York metropolitan era and the amount of money they received in state and federal funding and the degree of their adherence to what are known as substantial equivalency requirements. That is to say, minimal standards for educational exposure and achievement intended for private schools in the state of New York. This story launched a series of subsequent stories that has captured the attention of many people in New York, including many people in the Hasidic communities of the greater metropolitan area, has indeed raised the ire of many in those communities. But it has renewed attention upon Haredi Judaism in the New York metropolitan area, and we would like to help illuminate with a textured, rich account of the origin and growth of one of these communities that stands as really a representative, as a particularly distinctive representative of traditionalist Orthodox life in the New York metropolitan area. In doing so, we want to make clear that the story we tell is really embedded in the larger story of religion and communitarian existence in the United States. That is to say, the existence of strong forms of community, especially religious community, that have found their way on the landscape of the United States and that have been fortified by the emergence of a very powerful swell of political power that religious conservatives began to manifest, especially in the late 1970s. Some of you may remember the birth and growth of the Moral Majority in 1979, a movement founded by the Reverend Jerry Falwell. What interests us is the way in which the arc of the community we've studied, Kiryas Joel, and the newly revitalized religious conservative movement operate in parallel and often entwine with one another in very interesting ways, which makes us feel somewhat justified in entitling our book American Shtetl. This is a decidedly American phenomenon that we're going to talk about, and that's going to be part of the burden of our task this evening, is to make this case. My task, before handing things over to Nomi, is really to explain the second term in the title, Shtetl, a term with which some of you may be familiar. In fact, I venture to guess most of you. What is a shtetl? Well, a shtetl is, first of all, etymologically, the diminutive form for town in the Yiddish language. That means, according to that authoritative source on Yiddish language, the Oxford English Dictionary, a small Jewish town or village in Eastern Europe. Now, I want to present to you a contrast between two understandings of the very idea of shtetl. So there's a mythic notion of the shtetl that has been provided to us by belletristic literature and theater, most notably Fiddler on the Roof, which lends to us this notion of a shtetl as a completely insular community comprised of a homogeneous group, completely committed to its traditional ways, and very much at a remove from the rest of society. That idea of the shtetl stands in stark contrast to the actual historical shtetl as we know it. Several leading experts, such as Professor Samuel Kassow and Northwestern's own Professor Yochanan Petrovsky-Stern, have told us, have really instructed us, that the shtetl was not a completely insular, homogeneous world. The shtetl, as it took rise in actual historical circumstances in East and East Central Europe, was in fact a teeming cauldron of religious, political, and socioeconomic heterogeneity, not homogeneity. And never in the history of early modern and modern times did a shtetl achieve the status of a self-regulating government body. And I want us to think about that in the context of what we're about to present. Because Kiryas Joel, New York, or Kiryas Joel, or KJ, we'll use all three to refer to the community, really hews much closer to the mythic ideal of the shtetl than to the actual historical shtetl, both in original conception and in operation. So what is it that we're talking about? We're talking about a legally recognized village of 33,000, and there's been a recent update according to new census data that suggests that the population is now 36,000. So the 33,000 figure was from the 2020 census, but that's been updated. We're now talking about a community of 36,000 in Orange County, New York. And the 36,000 residents are almost entirely followers of the Satmar Hasidic group, which we'll talk about in just a minute. What is so distinctive about this community is not only the degree of homogeneity in religious terms, but the extent to which it follows a very particular way of life, which is described in Satmar literature as Derech Yisrael Saba, the way of the ancient Israel. The community arose with the express purpose of becoming a self-contained enclave at a remove from the seductions and allures of a teeming urban environment. And to a great extent, it has achieved the goal of creating that enclave. As you enter into the town, you will encounter signs like you see in the top right that encourage visitors to adhere to the modesty norms of the community, both in terms of dress and in terms of public conduct, in terms of language used, even to the point of maintaining gender separation in public areas. And although there are signs on streets which encourage men to walk on one side and women on another, that actually is not how Kiryas operates. But in many other domains of life, gender separation is indeed the standard procedure. What is also distinctive about Kiryas, in addition to its homogeneity and its success in achieving that goal of a self-contained insular world, is that it has come since 1977 to exercise a large degree of what we call local sovereignty, which is to say that in 1977, Kiryas became a self-regulating village according to the laws of the state of New York. And then in 2019, it sort of moved up a notch by effectively seceding from the town of which the village of Kiryas was part to become a self-standing town on its own, known as the town of Palm Tree. The community, the village, is known as Kiryas, and that is because its founding figure, the founder of the Satmar Hasidic dynasty, was this man, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, who emanated from one of the most interesting and intense families to take rise in the Hungarian Unterland in the northeast quadrant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Teitelbaum family was renowned for its combative spirit in defense of Jewish tradition, believing that all forms of modern secular culture and even modern religious culture were threats to the continuation of the path of the ancient Israel. And this combative quality was deeply ingrained in the personality of Joel Teitelbaum, who took aim at all perceived enemies, those who manifested a form of Jewish orthodoxy that he deemed less stringent, those whom we might identify in contemporary terms as modern Orthodox, those who sought to introduce reforms into Jewish ritual practice under the name in Hungary of the Neolog tradition, and most significantly, those who advanced the view that it was time for Jews to begin to return to the land of Israel under the rubric of the Zionist movement. Joel Teitelbaum reserved a special opprobrium for the Zionist movement, which he regarded as, according to his own words, the greatest form of spiritual pollution the world has ever seen. Because he believed that by moving back to the land of Israel before the advent of the Messianic era, which can promise us is quite imminent, that was arrogating to the human realm what was an explicitly divine prerogative. And thus, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum is renowned or notorious, depending on one's perspective, for his anti-Zionist fulminations, perhaps most famously in his book from 1960, Vayol Moshe. For reasons that I don't have time now to explain, but would happy to elaborate upon in Q&A, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, who settled in the city of Satmar, which was its Hungarian name, but after 1920 became the Romanian town of Satu Mare. He actually first came to Satu Mare in 1934 and was only in that community for 10 years until Nazi German forces invaded Hungary in 1944. That's because after 1940, that Romanian territory reverted to Hungary for a brief spell. Germany sort of renounced its alliance with Hungarian leader Horthy, invaded Hungary, and the overwhelming majority of the residents and the followers of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum were deported within a matter of 3 or 4 months, beginning in the late spring of 1944. Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum survived, having been in Satu Mare for only 10 years, but laid the seeds for the Satmar community, made his way initially to a state of protected incarceration in the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, from there to Switzerland, from there a year in Eretz Yisrael and Palestine before the State of Israel was created, and then after a year he came to the United States on Rosh Hashanah 1946. And there he set about to recreate the community that he had begun to build in Satu Mare. He arrives in the United States, in New York, makes his way very quickly to a neighborhood of Brooklyn called Williamsburg, which at that point had a mixed Jewish community, including a substantial Orthodox presence, but which over the course of Rabbi Joel's leadership became predominantly, if not exclusively, traditionalist Orthodox or Haredi. It was there that Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum set about to rebuild his community by creating educational and religious institutions to cater to the tattered fragments of the European and particularly Hungarian survivor community. But at the same time, already in the late 40s and early 50s, he decided to entrust the task to his chief aides to find a place outside of the city which could serve as a site of safe refuge, as a retreat from all the tensions and pressures of the city, which could allow for cheaper housing for his followers, as well as a place of greater purity, less exposure to the contaminations of modern urban existence. And this proved to be a very trying task for the aides of Rabbi Teitelbaum, because it turns out that many residents in suburban New York were not keen on a group of Hasidic Jews moving in large numbers. It took about 25 years for the aides to figure out how to affect the purchase of property. They did so by inviting a cousin of one of the leaders, who was not an observant Jew, to serve as the front man for the purchase of land, which took place in 1972 in Orange County, New York, in the town of Monroe, when the first several hundred acres of land were bought with the intention of creating a separate neighborhood of the town of Monroe. And for 2 years, community leaders oversaw the construction of 25 single-family homes and 80 garden apartments to serve as the first stage of residence for Satmar Hasidim who wanted to leave the city to make their way to this enclave. Turns out that tensions arose almost immediately between the new residents of this development who began to make their way to suburban New York in the summer of 1974, and officials of the town of Monroe. And those tensions principally revolved around zoning. What constituted a single-family home? Was it permissible to place a ritual bath or a kindergarten or a matzah bakery in the basement of a garden apartment? These were the kinds of questions that arose and led to very severe tensions between the two sides, and in fact, in the fall of 1976, to the prospect of serious litigation brought by the Satmar Hasidim of Monroe against officials and residents of that town. To forestall a date in federal district court in Brooklyn, scheduled for, I think, October 26, 1976, there was a late night meeting on October 23rd after the Sabbath ended through to the early morning, in which a compromise was reached. It was agreed that, according to the laws of the state of New York, Kiryas would move from being a neighborhood within the town of Monroe to a village within the town of Monroe. And as you can see on the right, it's relatively easy to create a village according to the laws of the state. I just did something. Oh, okay. It's relatively easy to do so by getting 500 inhabitants who inhabit a space that is no more than 5 square miles, getting their assent, getting the surrounding town to agree, and then you have a self-standing village. This represents, I should add, a fascinating transition from a private aggregation of property owners exercising, I should add, that basic liberal right to purchase private property into a public square. Almost overnight, as it were, between 1974 and 1976, this private collection of property owners became a Hasidic public square. Really fascinating, enlightening transition. And then in March 1977, the Secretary of State of New York State, Mario Cuomo, signed the documents allowing for the official incorporation of Kiryas as a village according to the laws of New York. By many measures, the story of Kiryas is a success story. Certainly by the measures of the community itself. If we think only in population terms, you can see stunning growth from the first available census figures that we have in the year 1980 up to 2020. And by the community's own estimates, by the year 2036, there may be as many as 75,000 residents of Kiryas, which would transform it from a town to the first Hasidic city outside of the state of Israel, and arguably in the world. Another measure of success is the overwhelming homogeneity of the community. And again, remember that contrast between mythic and historical examples of a shtetl. This is a community intent on the preservation of its distinctive way of life, and one of the ways it does so is by assuring homogeneity. Well more than 99% of the community, excepting a number of childcare and occasional workers in the community, are Satmar Hasidim. They speak a language, according to the 2020 census, other than English at home. The updated figures, 4%, according to the 2020 census. We can assume that language is Yiddish, because if you walk down a street in Kiryas, you will hear nothing but Yiddish spoken. It is the language spoken 24 hours a day from cradle to grave. It is a key tool of preservation of the community, and stands as a success that it continues from generation to generation. Another measure of success is the quite expansive educational system, especially the private educational system of cheders and yeshivas that educates the overwhelming majority of the community. There is also a public school in Kiryas, about which we'll hear in just a bit. The overwhelming majority of the town's kids go to the private school system where they're educated in Satmar religious and educational norms. A very small percentage of the community, under 8%, have bachelor's degrees. So in contrast to the mainstream American Jewish educational ideal of going to the university as a means of achieving upward mobility, and then from there to an advanced degree after that, this is a community that actively eschews that regards this as indeed a threat to its ongoing existence. Another measure of success of the community is its ability to preserve modesty norms as expressed in the signs that greet you as you enter the village, but in many other ways, including by having a kind of regulatory body, the Vadat Tznius, the Modesty Committee, assuring communal observance of the modesty norms of Kiryas. Another measure of the way in which Kiryas has assured, as much as is possible, adherence to the path of the ancient Israel. And finally, another measure of success, at least according to a substantial number of people in Kiryas, is the fact that when faced with difficulty, it used its latitude and deftness to create a self-regulating municipality, and thus to assure as much autonomy as possible to preserve that distinctive way of life. Kiryas is, as I said, a self-regulating municipality according to the state of New York. And yet, it would be an exaggeration to say that all is well in this community. First of all, the main problem from which issue to this day many other problems is the fact that Joel Teitelbaum died after living a very long life and left no heirs to the throne. He was the first Satmar Rebbe, and his three daughters predeceased him. He had no male heirs. The task of succeeding him fell to his somewhat maligned nephew, who was sort of plucked from relative obscurity in Brooklyn to become the second Satmar Rebbe. That was Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum, known as the Baruch Moshe. What's so interesting about his attempt to secure the degree of legitimacy of his uncle was that the widow of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum regarded him with disdain. And in fact, around the Rebbitzin, known as Alta Feiga, the widow of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, congregated a group of people who believed themselves to be the true followers of Joel Teitelbaum. They became known as the Bnei Yol, or in Satmar versions of Hebrew, Benayol, the sons or children of Joel, who opposed the second Satmar Rebbe, led in many respects by the Rebbitzin, a rare instance in which we see a publicly visible woman as really a communal leader. And thus began, almost immediately, the emergence of fissures within the Satmar community that have compounded to this day. A major compounding of the fractiousness within the community came in 1999 when Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum decided to really, in a sense, divide the Satmar Empire, whose two major centers were in Williamsburg and Kiryas. His eldest son, Rabbi Aaron Teitelbaum, believed that he would be the heir of the entire empire. In 1984, he had been appointed rabbi of Kiryas. There was every reason to believe that he would be appointed to succeed his father. And yet in 1999, Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum told Aaron Teitelbaum, you can have Williamsburg or Kiryas, but not both. And this came as a total shock to Reb Aaron. And what ensued after that was really the division of what is known by some, Malchus Satmar, the Satmar kingdom, into two halves. one led by Rabbi Aaron in Kiryas Joel, and one led by Moshe's third son, Zalman Leib, in Williamsburg. That division into two camps led, in some instances, to physical violence between the sides and intense litigation, which you can read about in exceptional detail in our book. And it is important to note that there's a long-standing inhibition or taboo within traditional communities to not appeal to Gentile courts, secular or Gentile courts, to Arkaot Shel Goyim. That taboo was cast aside with abandon, as you can read about and as we'll soon hear. So there are fissures that emerged within the community. And another wedge within the community was the decision to create a public school in the community. You might ask, for what reason might there be a need to create a public school? And that was in order to educate special needs children within the community, as we'll hear about more. So there are troubles within the community, and there is tremendous opposition to the community from without, especially because of the rate of growth of Kiryas Joel. In suburban areas, and certainly in suburban New York, there is intense contestation over valuable natural resources, principally land and water. When you have a birth rate and a degree of expansion, demographic expansion like we see in Kiryas Joel, there's a constant need for new housing and new land and water as well. This has led to immense tensions with the surrounding neighbors in Orange County, New York. One of the chief sources of contestation was over Kiryas Joel's attempt to tap into the New York State aqueduct by building a pipeline that originally was priced at about $19 or $20 million in 2013, but has now risen to $100 million. One of the ways in which Kiryas Joel managed its growth, assured that it would have adequate all the new couples in the community, was to annex additional land. And this too became a source of extraordinary tension with the surrounding communities of Orange County, New York. One of the things that's so striking to us is when we consider the tensions within and the tensions without, we notice the persistence, the ubiquity, really, of strife. It has been a constant in the history of this community. And yet, the community has continued to grow at a remarkable rate, suggesting, at least as a speculation, that strife has been a catalyst to growth, not a deterrent. In any event, the way in which the two sides, the neighbors of Kiryas Joel outside in the town of Monroe and those within who belong to the mainstream establishment faction associated with Rabbi Aaron, the way in which they negotiated a modus vivendi, a way of living together, was for Kiryas Joel to secede from the town of Monroe and create its own self-standing town known as Palm Tree, which is the English translation of the name Teitelbaum. So I'm going to pause at this point and hand things over to Nomi to talk to you about the American ways of this community. Yeah, look.
How's my volume? You can't hear me? Okay, someone want to show me how to turn the volume up? You'll do it? Okay. So I'm going to allow for, let's see. Any better? Great. Okay. All right. So picking up the story, as David has already suggested, the story of the Satmars of Kiryas Joel is an American story as much as it is a Jewish story. It's also a story about changes that were taking place in American society and struggles over the meaning of the Constitution and the principles of liberty and equality embodied in our Constitution that were occurring in the very time period that the village of Kiryas Joel was being formed, starting in the 1970s. In the 1970s and going into the 1980s, as many people will recall, America was retreating from its recently declared, and in hindsight, perhaps somewhat short-lived, commitment to integration. The 1954 decision of Brown versus Board, denouncing segregation, had defined liberalism in the Cold War era, and for many Americans, it seemed to represent a political consensus. So if we look at this slide over here, many of the outsiders who brought legal challenges against Kiryas Joel, like this fellow over here, Louis Grummet, who sued the state of New York when it passed the law that allowed Kiryas Joel to have its own public school district. He was a deep believer in that Cold War era integrationist vision of liberalism. But then again, so too were many of Kiryas Joel's most ardent supporters, like the other fellow on the slide, familiar face to some of you, I'm sure, three-term Governor Mario Cuomo, who, as David mentioned, signed the law creating the village, and subsequently, as governor, signed the legislation allowing Kiryas Joel to have its own public school district. As it happened, Governor Cuomo happened to have been this fellow Louis Grummet's mentor and boss. So there's some irony there that it was Louis Grummet who spent, as it would turn out, a decade suing the state of New York and his erstwhile mentor, Mario Cuomo, over the formation of the school district. So that's a familiar vision of a liberal vision of the values for which America stands, a version of liberalism that's deeply committed to integration. But as we all know, Brown v. Board's mandate to desegregate was met with widespread resistance, not only from white segregationists and not only from a broader population of white parents who objected to busing and other strategies for desegregating schools, but also on the other end of the political spectrum. For example, from Black nationalists who early on perceived that desegregation would prove to be a hollow hope. So by the mid-1970s, which, as David has recounted, was when the Satmar settlement of Monroe was just getting off the ground. This is before, not only before the village was formed, but before anyone had the idea of forming a Satmar village. That was a time period in which the proposition that separate is inherently unequal was being roundly rejected by various groups on both the right and the left. Alex Haley's Roots, some of you will remember that, aired on television in 1977, which is the very year that the village of Kiryas Joel was incorporated. And over the ensuing decade, ethnic pride movements sprang up across the racial and political spectrum. And multiculturalism and communitarian ideas and even more radical separatist movements gained growing support, all of them challenging the melting pot ideal as an insidious mechanism for making minorities conform to the norms and values of the dominant group. Now, this dovetailed with the retreat from another core principle of the erstwhile liberal consensus, namely the principle of separation between church and state. Like Brown v. Board's principle of integration, the holding that the Constitution mandates church-state separation was a post-World War II artifact. It was only in 1947 that the Supreme Court stated that the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment embodies this principle. The actual words of the Supreme Court were, in this 1947 case, that the wall between church and state, this was quoting Thomas Jefferson, must be kept high and impregnable, and that no breach could be tolerated. Language that evinced, or seemed to evince, a strong commitment to the principle of separation between church and state. Nevertheless, in this particular case, the court concluded that the particular program whose constitutionality was at issue, which was a New Jersey program subsidizing the costs of bus transportation to schools, did not breach the wall. The court reasoned that the funds that were provided to parents for bus transportation to schools, including private schools, including, indeed, it was almost entirely Catholic parochial schools, but they were not being used directly to fund the schools themselves. And in the eyes of the Supreme Court, this was a religiously neutral program, since in theory the funds covered transportation to any school, religious or secular. And this is why, following this 1947 case, to this very day, many states provide transportation or funding for transportation to religious schools, as is the case in Kiryas Joel. So following this rather ambiguous ruling in the late 40s, in the 50s, and really accelerating in the 60s and 70s, the court proceeded to demonstrate the seriousness of its commitment to the principle of separation between religion and state. First, it applied that principle to prohibit government funding of religious education and other religious institutions and activities. And then, in the early 60s, it declared what was, at that time, a widespread, common practice of prayer in public schools to be unconstitutional. Following that, in the late 60s and early 70s, it began to wrestle with the constitutionality of different kinds of school funding programs and publicly funded educational services like remedial education and special ed and other services like school lunch programs and therapeutic services being provided to students in parochial schools. And it's exactly here, with respect to these issues, that the story of the Satmars begins to intersect with the story of the changes and the challenges that were occurring in American constitutional law and in the attitudes of the broader American public. As is perhaps not as widely known as it should be, the school prayer decisions of the early 1960s sparked an immediate backlash as intense as the resistance to racial desegregation, which was only aggravated by the court's decision in 1971 in a case known as Lemon v. Kurtzman to strike down state programs providing religious schools with subsidies for the salaries of teachers who teach secular subjects and instructional materials in secular subjects. So predating Roe v. Wade by a good decade and equally reviled, the school prayer decisions were the catalyst that mobilized conservative Catholics and Protestant evangelicals, producing the political coalition that David referred to earlier, that would very soon emerge as a major political force helping to elect Ronald Reagan under the banner of the moral majority in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, just when the village of Kiryas Joel was being formed. Now, this early manifestation of the religious right was a Christian movement. It was led by Christian leaders, devoted to Christian causes, with an almost entirely Christian membership. But at least some of its agenda items, in particular, public funding for parochial schools, attracted Jewish support early on. Indeed, Orthodox Jews had been advocating for this since the mid-1960s, as witnessed by the creation of an organization, perhaps familiar to some of you, called the National Jewish Commission on Law and Public Affairs, which was formed by the Union of Orthodox Congregations in America in 1965. COLPA, as it's known by its acronym, which its founders described as the legal arm of observant Jewry, reflected a major change in Jewish attitudes specifically towards the Supreme Court's still relatively recently enunciated doctrine of separation between religion and state. Up until this point, that is the formation of COLPA, Jewish legal advocacy organizations had represented a united Jewish voice that strongly supported the principle of separation between religion and state. Indeed, it's fair to say that the leaders of established groups like the American Jewish Congress and the American Jewish Committee were among the chief architects of the Supreme Court's new liberal doctrines requiring the removal of religion from the public square and the denial of public funding to religious institutions, though it certainly bears mention that Catholics also played a leading role in bringing about those decisions. Indeed, it was only after Catholics, who had been really the leading force, achieved victory in their long campaign to overthrow what they perceived to be Protestant hegemony in public schools. It was only after their victory in that battle that some Catholics rather quickly began to regret the removal of religion from public schools that they had helped to engineer, creating a fissure within the Catholic community between conservatives who now joined with evangelical Protestants, we're talking about the 60s, the 70s, in demanding the return of prayer to public schools. So a fissure between such conservative Catholics and the many liberal Catholics who continued to oppose those kinds of programs. And of course, a similar division was opening up inside the Jewish community in this same time period, which created something of an affinity between Orthodox Jews and the emergent Christian coalition, particularly around the issue of school funding. Now, I want to be clear, Satmars were hardly at the forefront of this new conservative form of Jewish legal advocacy. Far from it. Rather, it was modern Orthodox Jews, like the renowned litigator Nathan Lewin, who took the lead in advocating for public support for parochial schools and other causes that Orthodox groups began to champion, like the public display of religious symbols. Lewin is an interesting figure in this regard, a modern Orthodox Jew. He graduated from Harvard Law School in 1960. He was a classmate and close friend of the late Justice Antonin Scalia. They both graduated from Harvard Law School in 1960, which was just 5 years before COLPA was founded. And then Nathan Lewin began working for COLPA almost immediately after its formation in 1967. A decade later, the village of Kiryas Joel would be incorporated, and 15 years after that, in 1992, Lewin would be hired by the village of Kiryas Joel to represent it in the case challenging the formation of the village's public school district. In the intervening years, the Supreme Court underwent very significant changes, moving away from its liberal heyday, changes both in its composition and changes in the way it decided cases, changes which expressed the waning support for integration and rising support for the right to preserve cultural differences and for the empowerment of groups, especially religious groups. The ascendance of the religious right is the most obvious source of these changes, which we want to stress. It's obviously an important part of the Satmar story, the backdrop to the story, explaining changes that took place in how the court interpreted the Constitution, broader changes in American legal and political culture that made America singularly receptive to the Satmar's project. But it's important to realize that progressive movements also played a role in bringing about these changes that I've just described in American political and legal culture. One of the most interesting of these was the disability rights movement, which also began to take rise in the 1960s and attained its first political victories in the mid-1970s. At the exact same time, a movement to change attitudes towards people with disabilities was beginning to develop inside the Satmar community. One of the first advocates for Satmar children with special needs was a woman, another, again, relatively rare example, but another example of a woman leader inside the community by the name of Malka Silberstein. She later became principal of the girls' private school in Kiryas and served as an extremely effective public spokesperson on behalf of the community when the constitutionality of the village's school district was challenged in the 1990s. Back in 1974, when Malka Silberstein gave birth to a child with Down syndrome, she was just 24, already the mother of 3, and still living in Brooklyn. And although she says she was unaware of the disability rights movement that was emerging in the United States at this very moment in time, her advocacy efforts for Satmar children with special needs almost exactly paralleled that broader disability rights movement in terms of both timing and substance. So in 1975, Gerald Ford, then president, convened the White House Conference on Handicapped Individuals. That was the language of the day. It was attended by delegates from every state, and representing the state of New York was the aforementioned Louis Grummet, who at the time was working for Mario Cuomo, who was then Secretary of State. And it was later that year that Congress passed the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act, as it was then known. It now goes by the name of the Individuals with Disability Education Act, which was one of the first victories of the disability rights movement, a federal law, which for the very first time guaranteed the provision of special education. Guaranteed it, paid for by the government, administered by public school districts for every child with special needs in the country. And this was the very same time period in which Mrs. Silberstein was conducting her first meetings advocating for Satmar children with special needs with Satmar leadership. The man she first turned to was a man who wore many hats in the Satmar community, including he became the first mayor of Kiryas and continued in that capacity until his death in 1998. But in the mid-70s, at the time that he first met with Malka Silberstein, the village hadn't even been incorporated yet. The village, the incorporation of the village was still some months away, but the future mayor of the village, he had already acquired a home in Monroe as part of that first wave of Satmar settlement. And by the early 1980s, within just a few years, Malka Silberstein and her family also joined the early Satmar exodus from Williamsburg to the town of Monroe, and she carried on her advocacy for children with special needs there. Now, there are really more than 3, but I want to stress 3 notable things about this story of advocacy for disability rights, which would end up becoming so pivotal, perhaps surprisingly, to the Satmar story. First, as I've already mentioned, there's this striking temporal conjunction. I think it's worth stressing insofar as it sort of punctures some common stereotypes. Far from lagging behind, the Satmar community produced its own reform movement dedicated to destigmatizing disabilities at the same time that the disability rights movement was emerging as a political force in the United States. Although the Satmars say they weren't aware of the new laws recognizing the rights of people with disabilities when they began developing their own programs, it's hard to believe this is just a coincidence. Instead, it strikes us as an interesting example, an early example of the permeability of the boundary between the Satmars' insular community, insular yet permeable, and the outside world. The second notable aspect of the effect of the disability rights movement on Kiryas Joel is that it reflected another change in American attitudes, the growing appreciation of human differences as an essential aspect of equality. Earlier civil rights movements, like the movement for racial integration, saw the route to equality as lying in the transcendence or even the elimination of differences, right? The whole idea race, creed, or color doesn't matter, or maybe doesn't even really exist, or at least we can hope that these differences will eventually wither away. This was the ultimate integrationist credo. And the disability rights movement, to a significant degree, subscribed to that integrationist credo, particularly insofar as it espoused the value of mainstreaming. But it also subscribed to a very different model of equality, what we call the difference model of equality, as opposed to a sameness model of equality, precisely because it recognizes the value and the need to accommodate differences. And it recognizes the right to have one's differences accommodated as an essential component of equality. So there's a tension between two different models of equality, the sameness model, transcending difference, the difference model, embracing, recognizing a right to difference. That tension was built into the new special education law, which on the one hand mandated that every child be evaluated and provided with an individualized education plan tailored to meet their individual different needs. But on the other hand, each plan was required to place the child in, quote, the least restrictive environment in the language of the new law, meaning the least degree of segregation from the general population. The problem, of course, as probably some of you are intimately familiar with, is that the program that is best tailored to a child's individual needs may, in some circumstances, well be one that separates that child from the general population. Some, or depending upon the circumstances, perhaps even all of the time. And whether that fulfills or contravenes the least restrictive environment requirement of the law, of the special education law, will always be open to debate. Furthermore, what actually constitutes the, quote, general school population, again, language from the statute, from which children with special needs are not supposed to be excluded, into which they're supposed to be mainstreamed? Malka Silberstein sought to end the exclusion of people with disabilities from the life of the community, her community, the Satmar community. She wanted children with disabilities to be able to participate in the community's ritual life and social life, and above all, she wanted them to be able to participate in the community's educational institutions, to attend school hand in hand with their siblings. In other words, she wanted them to be mainstreamed, to be integrated, but into the Satmar community, which itself is separated from the outside world. So in keeping with her vision of mainstreaming, the first program that she helped to establish in Kiryas Joel in the early 80s was a privately run school within a school located inside the Beis Rochel, that's the girls' private school in Kiryas Joel. And not long after doing that, the school district that served the town of Monroe set up its own program inside the Beis Rochel building, which provided supplementary special education services to students who spent most of the day in the school's regular program. The establishment of that program really reflects the culmination of a mutual learning process. The Satmars were newly aware of the laws, the special education laws that made every child with special educational needs entitled to services from their local public school district. And the school district was newly aware of the existence of a population of children inside the village, inside the Satmar community that required these services. And together, the village leaders and the school district superintendent negotiated an arrangement that fulfilled the district's obligation to the Satmar children to provide them with these services while respecting the Satmar's desire to keep them in their own community by setting up programs inside the private religious school. Until 1985. All this occurred in the earliest years of the village's formation, but in 1985, the Supreme Court handed down a pair of decisions addressing a question that had long troubled many people and had long gone unanswered. Was it constitutionally permissible for public school districts to provide services to children in religious schools, or did that constitute a violation of the Establishment Clause and the principle of separation between church and state said to be embodied in that clause? And if it was deemed to violate the Establishment Clause, as many people thought it did that mean that all children with special needs are required to attend public schools? Or would that violate the parents' right to control the upbringing of their children and decide for themselves what kind of education their children would receive and what kind of school they would go to? If delivering publicly funded services to children in parochial schools is deemed to violate the Establishment Clause, that could have the perverse effect of violating the Free Exercise Clause, another clause of the First Amendment guaranteeing the free exercise of religion, which has long been understood to protect the rights of parents to send their children to religious schools. Even more perversely, if one held that it was impermissible under the Establishment Clause to provide special education services to children in private religious schools, that would have the effect of requiring only the most vulnerable children, only children with special needs, to be sent to public schools, while children without recognized special needs would be permitted to attend private schools. So this was a conundrum that had been dodged for decades until 1985, when the court took the position that programs like the one that had just been established inside Kiryas Joel were unconstitutional. Now, 12 years later, the Supreme Court would reverse itself and declare that it is permissible for school districts and other public entities providing services to children to deliver them to parochial school students in the buildings of their schools. That's the law of the land today. And indeed, it's fair to say that events that subsequently took place inside Kiryas Joel played no small part in bringing that reversal about. But in the interim, the Satmars and everybody else around the country who sent their children to parochial schools had to deal with the law as it was declared to be. In 1985, no delivery of publicly funded services inside religious schools. So the solution, if we can advance this, which I cannot, so we may have run out of illustrations, but the solution devised in Kiryas Joel was to get the state to pass the aforementioned law, allowing the village to establish its own separate school district. That is the answer to the question of why would the Satmars want a public school. That was the law that was challenged by this fellow, Louis Grummet, a litigation that went on for nearly a decade, from 1990 until 1999, punctuated in the middle by a decision from the Supreme Court. So this brings us to the third notable aspect of the role that the disability rights movement played in Kiryas Joel's history. On the one hand, this litigation and indeed the creation of the public school district to respond to the conundrum over special education is what precipitated the conflict that brought the Satmar village to the attention of the outside world. This is what thrust it into the national spotlight and ended up subjecting it very publicly to a challenge, a constitutional challenge, to its demand for insularity. The claim being that this was fundamentally un-American and a violation of America's fundamental commitments to equality and inclusion and separation of church and state. So the disability rights movement played a role in precipitating this, but at the same time, as I've mentioned, the disability rights movement also promoted this alternative vision of equality, a difference model of equality that was in many ways harmonious with the Satmar separatism and supportive of their right, and indeed the right of all groups to maintain their differences and have their differences accommodated. The ability of Kiryas Joel to be formed and to defend itself from legal attacks reflects this growing, broadening acceptance of this principle of accommodation of differences. But that principle stands and continues to stand in tension with the competing vision of equality, which calls, if not for the complete transcendence of our differences, then at least the inclusion of our differences in common spaces, common schools, common walkways, shared media, a shared society with common values. The case of Grummet versus the school district of Kiryas Joel became a screen onto which these competing visions of equality and competing visions of America were projected. It presented us, that is, it presented Americans, and it presented American Jews with a choice between accommodating a community's desire to have its children educated in their own language and cultural milieu, and requiring them to be educated in a more diverse milieu. Now, in order to know what the fate of that case was, either you can ask us in the Q&A, or you can read our book, which documents the many changes that have taken place both inside the village, but also in the American legal system and the broader American political culture between the time the Supreme Court handed down its decision in 1994 and today. For now, I'll simply say, by way of perhaps a teaser, that we can look back on the 1994 decision as a transitional moment in the movement toward what we are seeing today, which is really the near total triumph of the Christian right's attempt to reform, overthrow the liberal Warren Court's interpretations of the First Amendment and replace it with a vision of the First Amendment of their own. We'll be happy to answer questions about that and everything else that we have shared with you. I think we'll step over here maybe. Or do you want to come up here, David? And we'd love to do some Q&A.
Okay, so questions? We have the gentleman in the blue jacket. I think we're going to wait until we get a microphone to you. As we do that, I just want to express our deep thanks to Nancy Gelman and the staff of the Crown Center for all of their really wonderful work in extending hospitality to us. Thank you. Yes, please.
Who controls and administers the degree to which the criteria for special ed and, in fact, in general education in these schools goes on?
So it's a very, very complex process, which is the case. They're subject to the same laws that any parent of a child sitting in this room in the past or in the present is subject to. It's a complex system that, first of all, right, it's a federal law, but it's not administered by the federal government. The way it works is that the federal government provides block grants to states. States don't have to accept them, but these very valuable funds that every single state chooses to accept come with strings attached, namely that these funds be used to provide special education to every child in the state in compliance with the federal requirements. The states, in turn, delegate the responsibility for implementing and delivering the services and evaluating children to local school districts. So a fundamental misunderstanding that many people have, I did not understand this. I used to think that what public school districts did pretty much exclusively was run and administer public schools. This is incorrect. Public school districts are charged with responsibilities for every single child who lives within their district, regardless of whether they attend public school, a private school, or are homeschooled. They're required, there are many different, not only responsibilities to provide special education, remedial education. With regard to special education, the responsibility begins with, first you have to identify them, then you have to evaluate them. It's a complex administrative procedure. And parents have the right to challenge. So it's an exceedingly complex system that makes it very difficult to scrutinize the claims, such as those of the recent investigative reporting, that suggests that maybe there's some major scamming going on. And we talk about that. I would simply say, I have yet to see enough information. Notwithstanding how in-depth the investigative reporting has been, I think precisely because the special education system is so complex and not well understood, that reporting does not provide us with a sufficient factual basis to know if really there are people performing this function who shouldn't be, or if funds are going to services that they shouldn't be going to, or really whether this is, just the same kind of heartbreaking situation that I'm sure there are people in this room who have faced with their own children.
Yes, please, right here. Wait, if you could wait until the microphone. I also want to particularly invite any students who are in the audience to identify themselves if they'd like to ask a question.
How did you decide to write the book, and what was your biggest challenge in gathering information for it?
I followed Nomi, who, by the way, is my wife. She had been interested in the way in which strong forms of religious subcommunity operate on the legal and political landscape of the United States. She was interested in a variety of different religious communities, ranging from Christian to followers of an Indian yogi, to a community in suburban New York called Kiryas. And I would sort of periodically check in with her and sort of see that she was interested in this very interesting community in suburban New York, which seemed to me to be unprecedented in the annals of modern Jewish history, certainly in the diaspora. That is to say, a self-regulating form of local sovereignty, recognized and in some sense blessed by the state. So I would look over the dinner table and see what she was working on, and sheepishly asked on more than one occasion, do you think maybe we could do something together on this community? And her initial response was not enthusiastic, I must confess. But over time, I think she saw some of the benefits. And I sent a letter to the community, to the person responsible for being the public-facing point of contact. At that time, it was the superintendent of the public school district, Dr. Stephen Bernardo, who told me come. And so I showed up almost 20 years ago and was really surprised from the very beginning. It was the first of many surprises that would accompany us along our journey. Because what I was told when I said I'd like to conduct research on the community was not no, you have no right to be here, and we will give you no access. What I heard was the following. We've reached the age of 25 or so, and we're really interested in seeing how we appear to the outside world. And we think you can play a role in helping us to understand that. And that was just stunning to me, and sort of the first instance in which my stereotypical impressions were overturned. And from that point on, doors kept opening. We had access through the mainstream faction associated with Rabbi Aaron Teitelbaum. But then when we encountered people from the other side, followers of Rabbi Zalman Leib, they'd ask us, well, whom did you speak to last? I said, I spoke to someone from Rabbi Aaron's team. And they said, come on in. Sit in that corner, and we'll tell you how it really is. So in some sense, we benefited from the existence of 2, or actually 3, factions within the community. That provided us with additional leverage to find out sort of different angles on the story. And I should just say that for me, this really required some measure of professional retooling, because I am most of the time an intellectual historian who studies published and sometimes unpublished texts of decidedly dead people. This was an instance in which, as we say in the language of IRB approval, if that means anything to anyone, this was dealing with very live human subjects, very opinionated, very animated, and it requires a different set of professional tools. I sort of became, in a fashion, kind of ethnographer. I didn't spend months on end. I spent several days on end on many occasions. That was sort of the role I played. And you'll see if you read the first chapter of our book, it's kind of an ethnographic account of daily life in Kiryas. Nomi may want to say something about hers.
It's a great question with the challenge. The challenge is religion. It made it really challenging, but also really an exciting project. One of the challenges was insofar as there was this kind of quasi-ethnographic or maybe genuinely ethnographic aspect to the research, which we felt was very important, but we were mindful from the beginning there was an inherent gender bias to that. The outward-facing, all the people, eventually David spoke to some women as well as men, but the preponderance were men. And all of the initial contacts were men, because notwithstanding we identified 2 women who we would call leaders. When David would ask them, are Altafaga, the widow, a leader? Oh, no, she's not a leader, because women are not allowed to be leaders. So there was, in terms of, first of all, the accessibility of people inside the community, men, the male sphere, the public sphere is much more accessible. Further questions about if I were doing that work, how open, if at all, would they be with me? That was one big challenge. We both had to do a lot of retooling. We mentioned one lawsuit. There were dozens of lawsuits, dozens. And not only were there dozens of them, but just 2 lawyers in the room, 2 interesting challenges, and maybe reflect some of the disjunction between a legal academic and a legal practitioner. It makes me look a little dumb to confess what were 2 important revelations for me. It's not working. I think it's not working.
Just pull it off.
Can you hear me? It's not working. This work? I'll use this. One thing I discovered, and I'll leave the other points for later because I want to allow for other questions. People have probably heard lately the term shadow docket. These are decisions that are made, that are issued by courts, issued by judges before a decision has been reached in a case. Maybe before the case has even been briefed or filed, because sometimes there are decisions that have to be made pending the outcoming or even the commencing of the litigation. So for just one vivid example, David mentioned the internal divisions in the community, really major schisms between the so-called dissidents inside the village and the established leadership divisions between the followers of each of the brothers. And as David said, notwithstanding the supposed prohibition on bringing internal disputes to Gentile courts, they're supposed to be taken to and adjudicated by rabbinical courts. Dozens and dozens of lawsuits in civil courts, with each side, as it were, prosecuting their case. Number one, there were so many lawsuits and sort of jurisdiction shopping and judge shopping, and the same case with a different name filed in a different, or a different case with the same name. It just untangling the tangled skein of litigation was difficult. But a big revelation for me, most of my other work, I read the published decision and I analyze the words of the decision. And it took me a while to realize most of the decisions in those cases ended up saying, after literally half a decade or going on a decade of litigation, finally the decision would come, and the decision would be, this case is non-justiciable. I mean, we cannot decide this case because it's an internal religious dispute. But 6 years before or 8 years before, a shadow docket decision would have been made where the two sides went and said, listen, someone's got to pay the bills, or they're going to turn off the electricity in the synagogue, pending the outcome of the litigation deciding which side is the true, really has the right to run the synagogue. And it would turn out the judge had made an interim decision awarding one side. So that was still legal analysis, but it was a very different kind of legal analysis from what I was accustomed to doing. It was very challenging.
Yes, back there, please. If you take the microphone. Yes.
Government services like a fire department, police department, who are they? Are they Gentiles who come in there to have, like, police and firemen on the Sabbath and stuff like that?
I strongly encourage you to read chapter 1 of our book. I know there are a lot of other questions. I'll try and be as brief as I can. This is a community in which people are expected to work, and I mean especially men. This is not a community in which men are expected or encouraged to learn all day. This was an ideal vision of Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum. So the percentage of men who work in the community is more or less equivalent to the percentage of men who work in the United States. Women are working in rising numbers as, I think, a manifestation of what we call unwitting assimilation to American ideals. And mind you that family size in Kiryas Joel ranges from 4 to 15 or 18 children. What we see, about a quarter of the community who work leave the community to commute to New York, consistent with Rabbi Joel's vision that the Shtetl should be close enough to the city for daily commuting. Another chunk work in and around Monroe, Kiryas Joel, and a substantial percentage works in the community itself, the chief employer of which is the private educational system. In the 2010 census, Kiryas Joel was the poorest community in America, as measured by having the largest percentage of people who live below the poverty line, about 60%. That number has fallen to about 43%, which you might say is still a very large number of people below the poverty line. But what we notice is really two things. There are no discernible signs of poverty as we typically identify them in America. There's no homelessness. No one is starving to death. That the definition of the poverty line, whether one is above it or below it, has a lot to do with household income and number of people in the household. Okay. What we also notice is a rising middle class and even upper middle class in Kiryas Joel. which creates some interesting tensions about whether it is a site of spiritual refuge or an increasingly materialistic shtetl, something which people debate. So that's a very interesting development. We might call it, there's a fancy French term, the embourgeoisement of Kiryas Joel. It's happening. In terms of the provision of services, the law enforcement is provided by the state police, though there is a private security firm employed by the community to watch over things, especially on the Sabbath. Fire and emergency medical services are provided by the community itself. There is a self-standing Kiryas Joel fire department staffed by residents of Kiryas Joel, Satmar Hasidim. And there is a very extensive Hatzalah, or ambulance service, whose workers are amongst the most medically knowledgeable people in the state of New York. They'll drive you to, from Monroe to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, if that's the specialty you need. And there are lots in between, the tales of which are to be found in chapter 1. So, yes, please, in the back. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not a student, but I was a student here.
I guess by some measure we're all students, but
No,
if
I
there are
was
any students,
here.
please let me know.
I would like you to back up on this whole conversation because I have lost the essence of it. I have two important questions to ask. I do want to hear what your cliffhanger is, but before we get to that, I'm not at all understanding how this community could have ever come to exist, and I'd like to understand if any other community in the country, other than the Amish community, and perhaps some Indian reservations, can compete with this community for its isolation. And who built this public school? I mean, did those 500 families build that public school, or 33,000 people build that public school? That's almost a rhetorical question. I really would like to understand the essence of how this is America, because this is a very isolated story.
Yeah. So it's not such an isolated story. They're actually meant, so it's in the context of Jewish history, a very isolated story. When, certainly not in Europe, as David explained, was there ever such a community. It's far from unprecedented in the history of America. There are many, many different religious communities that sought to separate themselves, live apart from the rest of society, form their own enclave, and function as self-governing, politically autonomous communities living in accord with their own separate system of law. There are actually many examples of that. The one writ large would be the Mormons, who went to the territory that became the state of Utah. But there are many smaller religious communities that did the same. For example, numerous what were originally Bible camps, summer resort communities established by Methodist or other Christian, that then evolved and became year-long, ceased to be merely summer resorts and ceased to be merely private. And so this is the second key point. Not all of them, but more than a few, follow this private pathway to political empowerment, to becoming official local governments, or in the case of Utah, a state government. Local governments are subdivisions of the state. How do you do that in the United States of America? By buying private property. By buying private property, by buying a tract of land, subdividing it, and renting or selling it to members of your community and only to members of your community. Then, once a community has settled, under the laws of virtually every state, residents of an area get to exercise the right to vote to decide if they want to have their area become, it might be a village, it might be a town, it might be a city. And that is what we call the private pathway to political empowerment, or sometimes we use the term communitarianism from the bottom up. And the Satmars really were just following a very old playbook.
To wit, the Satmars were actually preceded in this route by another Hasidic group, which in 1954 moved from New York City to Rockland County, New York. And 6 years later, as a result of zoning tensions with the local municipality, established the village of New Square, 1961. Skver Hasidim established New Square in 1961. This is a template which was looked upon by the Satmar Hasidim as a possibility for their own community. It wasn't the original ideal of Rabbi Joel or his followers to create a village. It was to create a shtetl. But out of necessity, through the zoning tensions that arose, a village emerged out of that shtetl. And we think that's a tradition that is deeply rooted in the landscape of America, extending back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony and John Winthrop's ideal of creating a city on the hill, in which we see the fusion of religious and political power. I think we have time for one question. I understand that there's a student or a former student with us. And so the last question to our...
Thank you. My question is just, you were discussing the intersections, I know. Thank you. You were discussing the intersections with the Christian right. So how is, can you describe a little bit more the, maybe beyond just the public education sphere, where Satmar communities were intersecting with the growing Christian right in the 70s, 80s, beyond? And I guess, as you were saying, going into now.
I wish we had longer time. I know so I will just refer as one little glimpse of broader trends to the Supreme Court decision that I left with a cliffhanger in the case that asked the question, when the state of New York passed a law allowing the village of Kiryas Joel, allowing the Satmars to have their own separate school district so that they could create a public school for their children with special needs, and only their children with special needs, does that violate the Establishment Clause? And there were two, to oversimplify, there were two different ways of interpreting the Establishment Clause. One which was very expressive of that liberal vision I talked about, that believes both in the value of integration and in a strict principle of separation of church and state. And that way of interpreting the First Amendment was vigorously opposed by the Christian right. And in that very time period, when that case began, the late 80s, early 90s, for the first time, organizations, conservative legal advocacy organizations, right? Basically, we need to have our own ACLU. One such group formed was called the ACLJ to promote their vision. And what did they do? They submitted amicus briefs in this case, putting forth, championing an alternative way of interpreting. And that is the way that prevailed. And it's a follow-up to the previous question. I'll just finish with this. According to that view, and this is explicitly what the Supreme Court said, repudiating the liberal integrationist, strict separationist view, there is nothing wrong with a religiously homogeneous community having its own public entities, its own political entities, its own local government, its own separate public school district, so long as the segregation is what we call in the context of race discrimination, de facto, not de jure. So long as the completely homogeneous demography is a product of private choice and private, the real estate market, who chose to buy or rent here, right? To whom did the owners of the property choose to sell? So long as the segregation occurred through the private market, through private choice, and the community just happens as a result to be religiously homogeneous, it is not disqualified by virtue of its religious homogeneity from exercising its rights under laws like this to form its own local government.
Yeah, I'll just say a final word. Over the last decade or so, one of the most powerful expressions of the intersection of religion and politics, and for that matter, Haredi Jewish groups and the Christian conservative right, has been over the matter of religious liberties, the ideal of religious liberties, the idea that, in some sense, a key, if not the paramount freedom afforded by the United States and its Constitution is the right to the free exercise of religion. That belief has really been transformed and has transformed the legal and political landscape of the United States with the very noticeable shifts in the American judiciary and especially the Supreme Court. One very clear manifestation, to be as empirical as I possibly can be, of that shift is a comparison of the results of the 2016 and the 2020 elections in Kiryas. In 2016, 53% of the community voted for Donald Trump. In 2020, we would argue, driven by the growing importance, the sense of the supreme value and importance of religious liberties, over 99% of the community voted for Donald Trump. That represented an abandonment of a kind of transactional pragmatism that defined Satmar politics, and for that matter, Hasidic politics in New York for decades. Whether we see the emergence of a new ideological conservatism within the Haredi and Satmar communities that resembles and indeed has close affinities to Christian conservatives remains a really important research question that will have to come back another time.
I told you this would be good.